I'm Valeria Carullo. I'm the curator of the exhibition Rationalism on Set, Glamour and Modernity in 1930s Italian Cinema. I generally work at the RIBA in London, the Royal Institute of British Architects, where I am curator of the photographs collection. My background is in architecture, and I've always been passionate about film and cinema in general. And so these various interests of mine obviously have sort of coalesced into this project. I am particularly, I tend to research a lot into the 1930s in general, both from the point of view of architecture and photography, and cinema from that period is also very interesting to me. However, I have to say that I had very little knowledge of Italian cinema of that period, and it's generally quite a neglected phase of the history of Italian film for a number of reasons, and probably one of them is the association of that period with fascism, obviously with the fascist regime. Also, from the point of view of the quality of the films, that's probably not one of the highlights of the history of our cinema, of Italian cinema. But what really attracted me to this period was the fact that I realized during the course of previous research in other projects how actually quite a lot of these films that had contemporary settings started to incorporate a kind of film set that was very, very modern, that was sort of following the ideas and the characteristic of the international modern movement. And that is something that really intrigued me because it's not necessarily something that could be said about European cinema in general. So the aesthetic obviously was much more minimal, more spare. The emphasis was on the lines, on the volumes, on the masses rather than on the details of the decoration. And the materials were very important. Obviously, there were new materials used, and glass much more than before. The idea that obviously without load-bearing walls, you could allow for much wider surfaces of glass, so you could allow much more light in. It was a completely different way of life, in a way, apart from a different type of architecture. And as a consequence also of this new type of structure, there was the development of the so-called open plan. So there was a much less separation between, spaces, specific areas of, say, of a house, for example. So that also had its influence in the development of these cinematic interiors. So in Italy, like in other countries, the role of set designer was sometimes covered by cinema professionals, so people who actually specialize in that, particularly in that field. And other times instead, we see the involvement of architects who, obviously designed actual buildings. So that's also particularly interesting because you have the coexistence of these different type of professionals, and that is something that we see in other countries as well. For example, in the United States, where there was a very strong influx of German, especially European continental and German designers. People who moved there obviously for better prospects, economical and artistic prospects, and then obviously in the 1930s also sort of trying to escape this very oppressive political climate in Europe. So they brought their experience obviously as architects, as designers, and also as set designers in some cases to American cinema. And we see something similar in Italy as well. Again, it happened a lot more, quite slowly in a way. But we have at the beginning artists really taking on this role of set designers. So the first film that's really, really important from the point of view of filmic architecture is called Patatrac. It's a film from 1931. And the set designers were two painters. So it seems to be in a way more in the tradition of what set designers were at the beginning of the century, where you had these sort of painted backdrops rather than absolutely real, three-dimensional sets. But these two painters actually are really interesting, both of them, because they were very interested in architecture, very interested in cinema, They had lived abroad, like many actually of their colleagues, during the 1920s. And so, like many of their colleagues, they were very well aware of what was happening in other countries, both from the point of view of cinema and the point of view of architecture. They themselves had friends amongst the young, modern Italian architects. So they had that type of outlook, and they were, as they themselves said, they were interested really in anything new. They had this sort of hunger for new, a new aesthetic as well. And so it's quite interesting that it was two painters that actually seem to have brought modern design into Italian cinema. But as I said, we have to look exactly, who these people were. So that's the first film that really shows all the elements, really includes all the elements that then we see in a lot of other films of the decade. And most of these films are actually romantic comedies, so they're quite sort of lightweight. But as I was saying, it's their contemporary setting that really allows them to become this sort of showcase for modern and modernist design. So they were really the first, and so they're very important to the narrative of the exhibition. But then we have another set designer, Gastone Medin, who actually we don't know very much about. He started very, very young. He did his first project of set design in 1930. And then he actually became the head of construction at the main production company in Italy, Cines. When he was very young, only 25, and he held this post for a few years, and he ended up designing, like a great number of film sets throughout the decade, and even later he had a quite long career. So he's particularly interesting and maybe more intriguing because we don't know much about him. But he definitely had an obvious knowledge of the international style and what was happening in the field of architecture, particularly Rationalism, which is like basically an Italian sort of the Italian branch of the modern movement, we could say. Obviously, that's why the title of the film is Rationalism on Set. And so we see how he really uses this modern vocabulary very confidently in a lot of the films he works on. And so we see these sort of open plan sets with very modern elements, and particularly what again I find very interesting is the use both by him and other set designers of really items of modern furniture that become almost iconic now, over the decades. Some of the chairs, for example, especially by Le Corbusier or by Mies van der Rohe, by Marcel Breuer, so all the the really big name of modern architecture, and so we see these elements, these items of furniture used repeatedly. Possibly they were the same from one set to the other, but I find that they were extremely symbolic of their aspiration, of this aspiration to modernity, especially of actually signaling within the necessarily restricted space of the film set that this is a really modern, this is a modern interior. This is it was a very powerful symbol. The Mies van der Rohe chair that we see throughout a lot of these films. So Gastone Medin is, as I said, is particularly interesting also because of the huge contribution that he gave to this field in the 1930s. Maybe the majority of the modern film sets were designed by him. Often people tend to think of Italy in that period, in the period of the fascist regime, as being quite isolated, and I suppose it was from a certain point onwards, especially from sort of a political, economical point of view. But artists and architects and filmmakers were actually very well connected, and had a lot of cultural exchanges with their sort of counterparts in other countries, other European countries. They were very well informed. They had first-hand knowledge. Often they had friendships with their counterparts in other countries. So there was this international exchange of ideas that was going on throughout the decade, which I think often sort of is sort of not considered enough. And so I hope that through the exhibition I'm really showing how I'm showing this concept. And one of the ways that I thought would be really useful to get this message across is to show side by side so show the film sets, and then side by side show real interiors, so interiors of architecture that was built, and then actually show all the sort of similarities, reciprocal influences, the very similar modern aesthetic, and therefore really giving this sense that these interiors, yes, they were fake in a way. They were, they probably sometimes were idealized, or they were sort of this ideal sense of a modern interior. But at the same time, I'm also, I think, demonstrating how close they were to real architecture, and all the photographs that show these real interiors, these real architectural interiors, come from the collection I curate, from the photographs collection of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and you will see that they have been sort of they can be identified by the black window mounts rather than white. So there's a clear sort of distinction between the film sets and the architectural interiors, but at the same time we look at them side by side, and you can almost look at them continuously and hardly notice a difference, which I think is really fascinating.